The thermometer outside Jake Morrison's kitchen window read 18 degrees below zero on that January morning in 1963, and the wind was screaming across the plains of South Dakota like it wanted to tear the world apart. Jake stood at the window with his coffee, staring at the white hell outside, knowing his cattle needed hay, and they needed it now. His neighbor Tom had been bragging for months about his brand new 1962 model tractor, calling Jake's 1938 John Deere Model B a dinosaur that belonged in a museum. This morning would prove which machine was built to survive and which was just built to impress. Jake pulled on his insulated coveralls and headed into the wind that stole his breath and made his eyes water instantly. The kind of cold that made metal brittle and turned oil into cold molasses. Through the blowing snow, he could barely see Tom's place a quarter-mile down the road, but he could make out a figure standing motionless by a tractor with its hood up. Tom's fancy new machine had already given up. Jake's 1938 John Deere sat in the shed exactly where he'd left it, and just looking at it gave him confidence. His father had taught him how to prepare these old engines for brutal cold, methods that went back generations. Last night he drained the radiator completely. No water meant nothing to freeze and crack the block. He'd filled the fuel tank to the brim to prevent moisture condensation. And he'd left the shed closed, but unheated, keeping the tractor cold and stable rather than creating temperature swings that caused condensation and rust. He grabbed the hand crank from its hook. That tool modern tractors had eliminated in favor of electric starters that were probably refusing to turn over all across South Dakota right now. Jake set the fuel mixture rich, retarded the spark timing, and gave the flywheel a slow turn. The engine groaned, metal grinding against metal in protest, but it moved. That was the key. It moved. Those wide clearances that modern engineers mocked as sloppy craftsmanship were actually intentional design, giving cold metal room to expand without seizing. For 10 minutes, Jake manually rotated the engine, slowly working thick oil through bearings and cylinders. This was impossible with modern high-compression engines. Their tight tolerances would bind up. But this old John Deere had been designed by men who understood that farm equipment needed to work in hell or high water, not just ideal conditions. After the warm-up ritual, Jake primed each cylinder with a careful shot of ether. Too much would damage the engine. Too little wouldn't fire in this cold. He set his stance at the hand crank and pulled hard. The engine coughed, sputtered, and on the second pull it caught with that distinctive pop, pop, pop that sounded like victory on a morning when everything was trying to die. White exhaust smoke poured into the frigid air as Jake let it warm slowly. 15 minutes of patient waiting while cold cast iron expanded gradually and evenly. That low compression ratio everyone joked about, 6-to-1 compared to Tom's modern 8 or 9-to-1, meant this engine could actually turn over when oil was thick and metal was sluggish. Less power in normal times, but it started when nothing else would. Jake was hooking up his hay wagon when he saw Tom walking across the field toward him, moving like a man who'd just had his pride broken by reality. Tom's face was red from cold and probably embarrassment as he got close enough to shout over the wind and the popping engine. "She won't turn over," Tom yelled. "Battery's good, but the starter just clicks. Engine's locked up solid from the cold." Jake nodded. He'd expected this. Those tight tolerances and aluminum parts contract different than cast iron when it gets this cold. Everything binds up. You try heating the block? Poured hot water on it twice, nothing. I got 200 head that need feeding and I'm dead in the water. Tom looked at the old John Deere like he was seeing it for the first time. "Think this old girl could pull double duty today?" "She'll do what needs doing," Jake said. "Always has." They loaded both wagons with hay, Jake's and Tom's, and that old 2-cylinder engine pulled the combined load across frozen fields without complaint. The massive torque these old low RPM engines generated, 600 revolutions per minute all day long, moved mountains if you had patience. Tom rode along on the wagon, watching his modern tractor shrink in the distance, useless metal sitting in a driveway, while a machine older than World War II did the work. "My daddy tried to tell me," Tom said, as they spread hay for Jake's Herefords. "Said these old tractors were built by men who remembered the Depression, who understood that a farmer couldn't afford equipment that only worked when conditions were perfect. I thought he was just being old-fashioned." Jake didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching a neighbor learn hard lessons. They spent the next 3 hours feeding both herds, and the old John Deere never hesitated, never faltered. That simple magneto-ignition system generating its own spark through magnetic induction. No battery to drain, no electrical components to malfunction. The massive, straightforward carburetor with passages so large that ice crystals couldn't block the flow. Every system designed for reliability over efficiency, durability over performance. By the time they finished, word had spread through the rural community about the equipment failures happening everywhere. Jake's phone rang all afternoon, neighbors asking if they could borrow his old tractor, or rent it or buy it for any price he named. The implement dealer in town called to say farmers were begging for any old equipment he had in his back lot. Machines he'd been planning to scrap were suddenly worth their weight in gold. The next morning was even colder, 22 below zero, and Jake found 3 tractors parked in his driveway when he looked out the window. His neighbors had brought their dead modern machines to him like patients to a doctor, hoping he could work some kind of miracle. Jake went out and looked them over. Expensive 1960 and 1961 and 1962 models, from John Deere and International Harvester and Alice Chalmers, all of them locked up solid from the cold. "Can't hand crank these," Jake told the assembled farmers. "Compression's too high, and there's no provision for it anyway. Electric start or nothing, and in this cold, the starters can't generate enough torque to overcome the internal friction." "So what do we do?" asked Robert, a younger farmer who'd completely modernized his operation last year. "I got livestock depending on me, and every machine I own is dead." Jake thought about it, looking at these desperate men who'd bet their farms on modern technology and lost. "I'll make runs for anyone who needs it. We'll set up a rotation. I'll feed your stock and you pay me in labor come spring. But this can't happen again. You boys need backup equipment, old equipment, machines that'll start when hell freezes over, because that's exactly what's happening right now." For the next 5 days, Jake ran his old John Deere 16 hours a day, moving from farm to farm, feeding cattle and hauling supplies, and doing the essential work that kept operations alive. The tractor never complained, never overheated, never failed. That simple splash lubrication system, with no oil pump to break. The cast iron construction that expanded and contracted uniformly without cracking. The unpressurized cooling system he could drain and refill at will. Every design choice that modern engineers had discarded in pursuit of more power proved essential when survival was on the line. On the 3rd day, Jake was helping Robert feed his cattle when Robert's wife came running out of the house waving her arms. "The diesel generator quit," she shouted. "We got no power and the house is getting cold fast." The generator was a brand new unit, supposed to be state-of-the-art, but it had seized up just like the tractors. The diesel fuel had gelled in the cold, turning into a waxy paste that wouldn't flow through the fuel lines. Jake looked at it and shook his head. Diesel's got advantages in normal weather, but it's a liability in extreme cold. These new low-sulfur fuels gel even faster than the old stuff. "So what do I do?" Robert asked, real fear in his voice now. He had 3 small children in that house, and the temperature inside was already dropping. "You got a kerosene heater?" "Just a little one. Not enough to heat the whole house." Jake thought fast. "Your old Farmall H still in the shed?" Robert blinked. "Yeah, but that thing hasn't run in 5 years. I was going to scrap it this spring." "Let's take a look." The Farmall H was a 1947 model covered in dust and bird droppings, but when Jake checked it over, he found it was basically sound. The magneto was intact, the engine turned freely by hand, and most importantly, it had a belt pulley on the side for running auxiliary equipment. Jake spent 2 hours cleaning points and replacing spark plug wires and draining old fuel, and then he hand-cranked that old engine to life. It coughed and smoked and rattled, but it ran. They rigged up the belt pulley to run an old generator Robert's father had left in the barn, and within an hour, Robert's house had lights and heat again. The setup was crude and inefficient, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. Robert stood there watching that ancient tractor provide power for his home, and Jake saw the moment when the lesson really sank in. "Technology's only valuable if it works when you need it," Jake said. "These old machines weren't built to be impressive. They were built to refuse to quit." there's a difference. The cold snap finally broke on the 6th day, temperatures climbing into the teens and feeling almost warm by comparison. All across the county, modern tractors thawed out and started running again, their temporary failure already being forgotten by farmers eager to get back to normal. But Jake noticed that several of his neighbors weren't trading in their old backup tractors anymore. Tom bought a 1945 John Deere Model A from a retired farmer and parked it in his shed. Insurance against the next time weather turned brutal. Robert got his old farm all running properly and kept it serviced. Even the younger farmers who'd mocked the old equipment started asking questions about compression ratios and magneto-ignition and design philosophies that prioritized reliability. The implement dealer told Jake that he'd had more requests for old tractors in 1 week than in the previous 5 years combined. Machines that were supposed to be obsolete had suddenly become valuable again because they embodied a kind of wisdom that modern engineering had forgotten. They weren't designed to impress anyone or win performance competitions. They were designed by men who understood that a farmer's life depended on equipment that worked every single time it was needed, regardless of conditions. Jake's 1938 John Deere went back to its normal duties after that brutal week, pulling implements and hauling loads and doing the steady, reliable work it had always done. The modern tractors on neighboring farms were more powerful and faster and more efficient in normal conditions, and they did most of the daily work. But when January rolled around each year, Jake noticed his neighbors checking their old backup tractors, making sure they were ready, preparing them using the methods Jake had taught them, hand cranking to break loose cold oil, draining radiators completely, filling fuel tanks to prevent condensation. The old wisdom being passed along to a new generation that had learned its value the hard way. 3 years later, in 1966, another brutal cold snap hit South Dakota, and this time Jake's community was ready. Old tractors fired up alongside modern ones, and when the modern equipment failed again, which some of it did, farmers weren't caught helpless and desperate. They had backup plans, redundant systems, machines that would start and run when everything else quit. The transformation wasn't complete. Farming was still moving toward modern equipment, and that was probably inevitable. But the smart farmers maintained a balance. They kept one foot in the past while moving into the future, understanding that sometimes the oldest technology was the most reliable when your survival depended on it. Jake Morrison finally retired in 1971, selling his farm to his son, who immediately bought 3 new modern tractors to run the expanded operation. But that old 1938 John Deere Model B never went to the scrapyard. It sat in the shed, fully serviced and ready to run. And when winters turned brutal, it came out of retirement to do the work that modern machines couldn't manage. Not because it was better in any objective sense, but because it was designed with different priorities, and those priorities proved their worth every time conditions became extreme. That tractor was still running 20 years later, still starting with a hand crank in sub-zero weather, still refusing to quit when quitting would mean disaster. It had outlasted the modern tractors that were supposed to replace it, and it would probably outlast the next generation too, silent testimony to the wisdom of men who understood that sometimes simple and reliable beats complex and powerful every single time. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story interesting and want to see more content about farming wisdom and rural American history, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with others who appreciate these stories from our agricultural heritage. This video is inspired by real events and the experiences of countless American farmers who faced similar challenges during the harsh winters of the mid-20th century. Jake Morrison is a representative character whose story reflects the real experiences of hundreds of farmers across the northern states who learned that old farm equipment often proved more reliable than modern machinery when weather conditions became extreme. This content is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals, manufacturers, or communities.